Why did you start with this project in particular?
So this project started out as one of my November materials that I was doing. The whole point of November was for me to push myself to just keep moving with materials and not get bogged down in the details.
How did you manage yourself not to get lost having this much amount of images?
Yeah, so there's definitely a fine line between having enough images that you can get all of the detail and information that you need to create your material while not overwhelming yourself with too many different references with variety. So I found the best solution.
So you went over and you create your croissants material, which looks quite amazing. For those who are watching for this on YouTube, this shot here is the one that we are talking about, and James managed to do everything of this in Substance Designer. Why did you start with this project in particular?
So this project started out as one of my November materials that I was doing.
Yeah.
And the whole point of November last year now was for me to push myself to just keep moving with materials and not get bogged down in the details and, moving between tenths of a value or hundredths of a value and kind of just keep a steady flow of the material work. So during November, I only wanted to spend 2 or 3 hours per material and just kind of pump them out consistently and get used to working in that kind of faster pace. And then after November was finished, I wanted to kind of work on the croissants more because I thought it was a fun idea. So afterward, I could really go back and actually spend the proper amount of time on it.
Great. So when you started making this project, did you have any kind of pre-planned version of how you wanted to render? Because if I could do it for some seconds, or maybe if you want to share your screen and show us on ArtStation how it looks. Yes, the presentation.
Yeah.
Because something I really love of your work, but it's something I tell to all of my students in their mentorship, is that it's not only about how it looks the material you make, it's also about how you present the material. Yes, you
Absolutely.
need to remember, guys, the material you present, it's about to be placed in an environment which has a context and tell a story. So that's super important that when you're doing portfolio work, you need to add some context. And James managed to do it quite great. We're about to see it. So I'm going to go into your full screen.
Ooh.
Great.
My computer's not a fan of this. Okay. Do this for just a short period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so during this project, I had an idea in my mind from the start of what I wanted it to look like. If I wanted a nice, smooth marble countertop underneath, and then a variety of croissants laying around on a cooling rack on top. I had a variety of reference images that I used during this. None of them quite perfect for what I wanted, so it wasn't necessarily a process of matching my material to a reference photo, but just using a lot of elements from different ones to get the look that I wanted in the end.
This is all fully done in Substance Designer. There's no 3D mesh, isn't it?
It's all 100% designer and tessellated height map. Yeah,
that's great. In fact, if you go down, I think you have a small shot of the material in the sphere without the base color that looks amazing. That's a great material.
I find the sphere renders really satisfying just because it kind of breaks the illusion of when you have a material on a plane, it kind of usually looks how it is supposed to look. But as soon as you put it on a sphere, you get to see the nitty-gritty of kind of what's
these
actually
are the things that kind of break my mind when I'm looking into material art, and that's why I love Substance Designer so much. And when it comes maybe to rendering Marmoset as well, is that you create a texture which is just an image, but when you get this image into the right software with just a plane or a really slim surface like a sphere, you get something that is amazing like this. Where did you render this?
So this was all done in Marmoset Toolbag 5.
Okay, the latest Marmoset. Did you find any kind of difference between Marmoset Toolbag 5 to Marmoset Toolbag 4? Because there's a lot of people who are just wondering about that, and they know if they want to jump from one version to the other, as it's actually quite new yet.
Yeah, I've only recently swapped to Marmoset 5. I got it while it was on the Black Friday sale. So I haven't done too much in it yet, but so far it's very similar. The UI is a little bit cleaner and more rounded and stuff, so there's been some changes in the user interface. But regarding actual render setup and lighting and stuff, it seems pretty similar. If anything, maybe it runs a little bit better and smoother. But for the most part, it's very, very similar to 4.
That's great.
I think a lot of the baking and texturing is a lot of the difference between 4 and 5, and I haven't taken a proper dive into that yet.
That's right. Yeah, me too. I haven't done a lot of baking in Marmoset 5 so far. I need to give it a little bit of a try, to be honest. So every good material for me starts with a really good organization. Yes, the first steps before jumping into Substance Designer are quite important. And what are the reference images you needed and the organization you needed before getting to Substance Designer to create a material like this?
So there are kind of a few key things that I look at when I'm creating a reference board for a new material. I want my kind of overall pattern and look for what I want. So kind of how are the croissants, in this case, spread out across the cooling rack? I mean, how are they displayed? How are they kind of spread? What's the spacing of them? That kind of thing for the overall kind of large shapes. And then I want to make sure I have reference images of all of the detail in a croissant, of the kind of slight bubbling from the baking and the cracking of it and the layers and stuff, to make sure I have as much in-depth information as I need on that. And then I also think it's really important to have kind of images that have the kind of feel and kind of maybe color grading and stuff that you want for your final renders. So
if you are trying to show us something in Purest, we are still watching our station just in case.
I wasn't. I can swap to a reference board if you want.
Yes, because I saw your mouse was moving around and you are still on the art station and the mouse disappeared, so it was like, ooh.
It's probably just a bad habit. Let me open this up.
Hey, our Blender, thanks for joining us today. We are taking a really deep dive into James Slater's artwork of his tasty croissant material that has been fully done in Substance Designer. No, you weren't that late, my friend. So you just arrived in time because we were just starting with the breakdown of the overall reference images. So when it comes to material creation and to making these kind of realistic materials, how did you manage yourself not to get lost having this much amount of images?
Yeah, so there's definitely a fine line between having enough images that you can get all of the detail and information that you need to create your material, while not overwhelming yourself with too many different references with variety. So a lot of times I'll have a fair amount of references in my board, but there will be a few key ones that I keep coming back to as kind of my main focus, and that's what I want to keep coming back to look-wise. So this one here was one that I kept coming back to in regards to kind of the overall shape of the croissant. And kind of distance between them on the cooling rack. Some of these, like this one here, was part of my first design of a more straight croissant.
Yeah, I remember that one.
I had a whole debate with myself over straight versus curved, and found out that there's actually a lot of debate about that, and it has to do with croissant quality and stuff. But yeah, really, it is a matter of having enough to provide information to make the material while not overwhelming myself, and having key ones that I keep going back to over and over again.
Yeah, I really like that reference image you have just to the far right. The ones that is kind of like a plate, that one.
Mm-hmm.
I really love that one on shape mostly. I think something like a big challenge. We are going to see it later, but I think one of the biggest challenges you might have was actually doing variation for each croissant, because sometimes when we're doing combined materials, we tend to trying to optimize things for ourselves to make it easier for ourselves to build it, and we kind of start to being repetitive over some details we had. In your case, that didn't show in your renders. How did you manage to get into that, or what did you do in order to avoid that when combining? You see what you see here, which has a lot of details, and in each image you have different details with what you did in Substance Designer.
Yeah, so let me see if I can flip over the graph show up here. Yeah, it does. So this was a little bit of a, I don't know what the best term for it is, a bit of a messy way to do it, but it was pretty simple and straightforward. I split my project into multiple graphs just to keep everything neat and run smoothly on my computer, so that I didn't overwhelm it with the nodes. So I had my actual croissant that I was creating in a separate graph, And once I was fairly happy with it, I brought it into this one to composite it with the cooling rack and marble countertop information that I had. So what I did to provide variation was use just a variety of warp nodes, the same one for every map, just to give a little bit of variation to the overall silhouette of the croissant and the detail on it, along with an HSL to change the color values just a little bit. And then from the croissant input itself, I used a random seed and changed that so that all of the noises and stuff that I used to build up the original croissant would all change slightly, so that they'd all keep that important detail and all of that stuff, but just be a little bit different from one another. And I have a variety of those plugged in for the final.
That looks great. So watching this takes me to a question that I should have done before. Yes, but in your case, you did a marble, let's say a marble base. Then on top of the marble base, you made a fine, I think it's called metal layer, or how do you call it?
Yeah, I did a metal cooling rack on top of it.
Yeah, cooling rack, yeah. And on top of that, you did the croissants.
Mm-hmm.
Did you plan that before starting with the material, or how did you organize that? Because when you have to layer materials, there's always a path to do it. And how did you layer your material in Substance Designer, if we could get into it?
Yeah, so this was my plan from the get-go. From the start, I wanted to have the cooling rack on a marble countertop, and I liked that image in my mind of having those different layers of all of those different material types all together. So I can swap over here, and this was my graph, kept really simple and clean for the marble countertop and cooling rack. The marble itself, I've created my own marble pattern node for use whenever I need marble. And I think that's really important. Whenever you're making a material that you feel will keep, an aspect of it will keep coming up in future work that you do, being able to create custom nodes to make life easier later down the line when, I need marble again for something. I have a node ready to go with a variety of parameters and values that I can change around as needed. So I had my base marble from that and a really simple cooling rack from a tile generator, and blended all of those maps together. And then I ended up adding making use of the light node specifically, along with some ambient occlusion. Sorry?
To create some shadows beneath.
Yeah, to fake shadows and kind of get that extra sense of depth, but from the cooling rack to the marble countertop underneath it. So that was kind of key in blending that.
So you made your own cooling rack shadow. Why did you do that instead of using maybe an AO and using an AO node and integrating that into your base color?
So I did both. I did end up plugging in my ambient occlusion and blending that into the base color. But then I also used the light to have kind of more specific shadow casting from one side, which, if doing that, it is important to know kind of where will my light in the final render come from so that it matches up with that, and there's no conflict with that. But that ended up helping a lot. So that's how I blended the marble countertop and the cooling rack together.
That's great. So,
and then from here, I added that into an Atlas scatter as the base.
And you organize. Okay, so if it's possible, could we get into Substance Designer to get these things a little more into detail? Or is the computer not because it can happen?
Yeah, just give me one moment to open that up. Okay, hopefully running this does not break anything for me.
That's the hard part of showing things inside Substance Designer. So at first, when we were talking about your reference images, you talk a lot about the shape. Do you want to get inside maybe the node and see how you actually created the shape? Because I think that's the most important feature of your material that most people want to know is how do you achieve that shape and how do you layer it to get that result?
Yeah, so the shape itself, I used an SVG node.
Nice.
Which I did solely for the purpose of it is extremely easy to be very specific about what I want the silhouette to be without messing around with individual shapes and trying to blend them together and stuff. And it's really easy to go back and adjust some of the points on it if I need certain areas to be thicker or thinner, or to go back and curve stuff, which I did at one point.
Hmm.
So I
2
ended up
seconds. Mike's telling me to let you know that maybe you can save the same file under a new name. So if you touch something right now, if it breaks or it crashes or something happens, your file will be
already
saved.
done.
Oh, already done? Great.
Did that
Perfect.
before this. Yep.
Keep on then.
Oh. I came prepared.
That's great.
I used the SVG node for the base silhouette that I wanted. And then I used a gradient with a curve node into a strong directional warp to get that kind of bend in the croissant that I wanted. And this is something that I came back to and did later on, because as I mentioned earlier, I had started with a more straight croissant, and through feedback and whatnot, I ended up needing to come back and make it more of a recognizable croissant shape. So that's a super easy way to add bend into things that can work for a load of different things and is really helpful. So it's a lot of minor values and warping and that kind of stuff for the base silhouette. And then to get the kind of layers specifically, I used a non-uniform blur grayscale with the anisotropy up to a value of 1. And that's what really provided that kind of change of what it does essentially is it looks for where the silhouette goes out and has those kind of outward bumps and makes those lighter values in the height map. And then where it dips back in during those transitions, it gets darker. So that really helps push the height map for what I wanted with that.
I love this.
And then, like I said, it's a lot of small changes after that.
Yeah, that's the part where you get into these finer details. Now, a lot of people think that the secret to making something realistic is laid only on the finer details, but if you don't have the right big shapes for your material, then the smaller shapes are not going to come naturally. And in this case,
really push the feel of the whole thing, so those definitely have to be right.
Yeah, if you didn't have this kind of like step section of your croissant, which actually gives this like the feeling of a croissant, then the rest wouldn't make any sense. Although I must admit that the surface detail you add to these are really nice. Like I feel like I can eat that croissant because even in Substance Designer it looks really great.
I appreciate that. It was a lot of layering of detail.
So how did you create these details? And yeah, I think that's the biggest question, how, because there's a lot of layered details in there. How did you have to divide it in different stages, or did you just go directly and added noise on top of that? Because that's something I always want people or my students in the mentorship programs to learn, is that details are not added just by doing noises. It's added by building shapes and applying it right with the right masks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important before you even start adding detail to break down reference images and really consider how is something made, what process does it go through, and kind of what are the key elements of that detail that need to be made. Because, like you said, you can't just throw noises on top of it and hope that it'll come out looking good. You have to really identify what those elements are and what the best way to approach making them is. So, for example, the kind of flaky layering in between the layers.
I love that.
Primarily comes from a crystal node, sharpened and stretched into these kind of thin layers that I can place between the different large sections of the croissant. And masking is really important for this as well. I have one mask that really kind of drives most of the things in this graph for where things need to be placed and the color later on.
Yeah, what I love of this is that you didn't went so far like to get yourself. I mean, these are complex materials to make, but yet the solutions you apply to these, they are really simple. This is not just like a super procedural method. It's just a tile generator that generates line. You invert that, and then you apply blurs and warps. That's pretty much it. And that was the solution.
In general, I feel that a lot of complex materials aren't complex in the nature of the nodes that you're using. It's just understanding how to use those nodes and combining them and layering them on top of each other properly.
Exactly. Yeah, that's something I really love about Substance Designer.
So yeah, the crystals are really what drives that kind of flaky nature, and putting them through a high pass really allows me to not have too many darker light values, but just capture the edges of those, which is what I really wanted for it. And then I have a simple cells noise that's warped a little bit and adjusted in order to get that slight bubbling effect from when the croissant is baking in the oven.
Yeah,
and
that's
that kind of
those
nice
bubbles
thin
that
bubbling
create
detail.
with the heat.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really great. I love it.
So
So
those are some of the main normal details. There's a lot of small things, but those are the kind of the main ones.
now to the hardest part, because creating, the height, the normal detail, the roughness is one thing, but creating the base color for this, it's completely different, and it's usually the hardest part. Like many materials start really good, but when the artist gets to the base color, if it's not done correctly, it can destroy the material they were creating. How did you manage to create such a realistic result in your base color in this case?
The short answer to that is layering. Masking and layering is the short answer. I'm still working on trying to improve my base color and stuff, because as you said, that's definitely a really difficult part of this process of
I even struggle with that.
to look realistic. So a lot of it comes down to, again, using that mask to identify the areas between the main layers of the croissant that I would want to be lighter, and the darker areas that become more caramelized through baking and get a darker color to them, mixed with a variety of noise maps, not randomly picked, but through a lot of trial and error and just experimentation of what yields the best result and why am I picking that noise map for this. So going through a lot of those to create, and using the curvature as well is a great way to pick up extra details for color maps.
Yo, I love
yields
that.
This interesting noise map with the silhouette of the croissant and stuff that I can then use in a couple of different gradient maps to capture different amounts of detail and color in them, and blending those together to get kind of a base color that I can then work off of from there, using a variety of masks and adding color, and really start layering on top of it. And through that, it's, like I said, a lot of mask work of just identifying what kind of area am I trying to color, what color does it need to have, and really just continuing through there, just going layer through layer, just building it up as I go.
Yeah, so I can see how I really love seeing the beginning and the end of the base color. I always love it. Well, in my case, I do something similar. I do a mix of curvature nodes, between the curvature solos and the curvature. I got this from Stan. At one point, I was looking into one of his graphs and I realized that he always started his base color that way. Doing just the curvature and curvature smooth combined, and from there you start creating different maps. They will follow the shape of your material. Now, the biggest question I have after this is, how did you went or integrate this into your roughness? Did you take your base color as a base for your roughness, or did you create it everything from scratch?
When I first started out making materials, I started making roughness from scratch quite a lot, but through just practice and a lot of work, I realized that a lot of what roughness of an object is in the real world does share values and has a direct correlation with the color of an object. If you have a stain on a counter, for example, it will have discoloration from the stain, but also it will change the roughness because it's a different source hitting that counter. So yeah, you can see from here, I took the base color that I had and pushed that into what is really a very simple amount, a very simple roughness graph, just taking that color map, converting it to grayscale. And in a lot of cases, inverting the color can be useful to create the roughness map. For this case, it wasn't the case because I did want the darker areas to have a glossier or shiner roughness value than the light areas.
Completely.
And then, combining it with a inverted curvature smooth, just kind of pick up some of that extra detail in between, and just minor adjustments to get it. But yeah, definitely coming through that.
Okay, so I have some questions here that people are kind of killing each other while we were speaking on the chat. So our blender is asking a quite important question. He asks, how can you have this layer over a flat surface, but then could this be applied to a model? Like these kind of textures, could this be applied to a model or not?
The process or like this material specifically applied to a model?
It's the specific material of the croissant in particular that he's asking for.
Yeah, so it's not optimized for that. You definitely could, depending on, I think, what the purpose of that croissant model would be. If you need to see the underside of it, then it might be a good idea to do this a very different way, as there is no underside to the croissant. The nature of Substance Designer is that it's all tessellated off of a flat plane for the most part. But if you needed something kind of appeared from a top-down view, you certainly could do it this way. And then once you have a texture, I suppose you could take this and build the model off of the texture and follow kind of the silhouette to raise up certain points of it, or have some kind of projection. Project the texture UVs down onto it.
Yeah, as well. I mean, you can I think that it really depends on what you want to achieve and how you want to do it by the end. So let's say if you want to do 3D food, yes, you do want to do 3D objects and then apply a texture on it. Well, what happens is that how you have to do it is going to be different, because you have a 3D object in the middle that is going to be having UVs, and it needs a little bit more of shape to have like this great this great shape that this croissant has. So if you're doing just in textures, as James is doing here, then the workflow would be different. In here, he had to kind of sculpt the croissant from zero in Substance Designer at the very beginning of it, as you can see here. Yes, and then started creating the different shapes, right? Now, if we could... wait, I want to see if there's any other question. Yeah, that's something I want to say, guys. Please, let's save the question for the end of the presentation. Yes, part of this going to YouTube is also promoting the community and leaving the questions for the people who are actually in the event instead of YouTube. So we kind of tempt them to come to Discord. It's kind of like, how do you say it? Dirty trick, dirty marketing trick. That someone would say. So I see that in there you have a is that a pixel yes, a pixel processor node. Do you have a float value or an integer?
I have a simple input-output to control the height scale of the graph.
Okay.
Which I started doing a few months ago. Just that every time I open up Designer and come back to the project, I know that my height scale is correct while I'm building up that height information.
So it's like a reminder of a number. That's it.
Yeah, so it's just inputting this so that I don't come back and it resets back to like 1 and my croissant looks extremely deflated.
Okay.
So all that's doing is just keeping that value there so that whenever I come back to work on this, it's consistent and always where it needs to be.
Okay.
So I've started putting that into my graphs with every new project that I work on to keep that consistency throughout the workflow.
Okay, that's actually quite great. This takes me to something particular that we need to go back to the full graph, because now we have talked about the croissants. I want to talk a little bit about the marble, because you said something before that is super important, and it's about creating your own notes about things that are going to kind of pop up recently. So just to also get into the content creation, flow. Yeah. Why did you create your own marble nodes instead of using the ones that maybe Painter offers you or Substance Designer offers you? And how does it look in the inside as well?
So I originally created the marble node for a different project that I was working on. I was creating marble tile, and I wanted to create it from scratch as much as possible, more for an exercise in my ability to create things from scratch in Substance Designer more than anything else. But from doing that, it gave me a lot more flexibility in how the marble ended up looking than some of the base textures that Substance provides would. So after I had finished creating that marble tile material, I ended up kind of grabbing the collection of nodes that really formed the base texture for that marble and throwing it into a new graph and creating a custom node and parameterizing it for reuse, so that for situations like this, I'd be able to come back to it and use it. So you can see if I click on the marble pattern here, that I've set up a variety of parameters for different things and to give it different looks. I have a couple different types of marble that I can swap between for it. To provide kind of different looks in that way. Or I can input a custom noise map, which will just allow me to use some kind of grunge or noise, input that in, and then the marble information of the dark areas will be based off of that specifically, which gives me a lot more control.
Okay. So when it comes to creating your own nodes, how do you know exactly what thing should you expose as a parameter, and how do you order these? How do you group them? How do you know exactly how to make it useful for another user? Because as I see it here, you can give this node to anyone, even if it is a beginner, and they will know how to use it. So how do you get to that level?
So a lot of it is I create my custom nodes after I have already created a material. Like I said, once I was done creating that marble tile, I figured that the marble would be really useful to have to be as a custom node that I could keep going back to. So it's really just identifying what are kind of the key nodes used in that graph that I will want to keep using over and over again. What isn't specific about that project, I suppose, and what will be useful to keep coming back to. And then when setting up the parameters for it, I try and allow as much flexibility as possible of what might be something that someone other than me would want to change about this. Anything that I could possibly think of not just the scale, but like, well, how varied do they want the veins of the marble to be versus do they want them all to connect up nicely together? So it's kind of just looking at it from a different perspective of, if I knew nothing about this project that I had just made and I needed to make marble really quickly, what are the most important things that I would need to be able to make whatever marble texture I needed to make? So here's actually the inside of the custom node that I've made. I've made this quite a while ago, but you can see the kind of different textures and information that I'm blending together and using to create veins and stuff for the marble, and how it kind of all blends together to create that kind of all of that varied noise and all of that kind of small detail.
Yeah, I like how you are actually blending these details, because it's not just that you are creating the noises and layering one over the other. You're being quite soft about this, and that's something I love, because most people or most students, when they are working on their materials and they can't really get that realistic feeling, is because they are applying the intensity of their notes way too high. But in here you manage to kind of do it softly, which keeps things realistic and also with a really great contrast as well.
Yeah, everything should be really deliberate in the strength in which you do it, of how important is for example, that kind of white cellular pattern kind of overlaid within the rest of the marble. And it's important for that added detail to add that depth and extra information that a marble texture usually has, but it shouldn't be the main thing that your eye is drawn to when you first look at the texture.
So I have a question from Mike here. He says, what did you scale the grunge smaller at the beginning? Would this not break the tiling?
Let me go back. Which grunge?
Which grunge?
I will say I do have a
make it tile, yes.
Make it tile photo grayscale here just to fix a few of the slight issues that I did have with tiling.
So it looks like it broke the tiling, but he fixes with that node. That node is usually guys use for photogrammetry as cases, but in this case, well, we were using it for something different. Nice to have you on board, really Nick. Important. See you soon. Yes, there we go. Sorry, one of the students was leaving.
I was just going to say, it's not always a great idea to do this because it can mess up kind of the blending from the edge into the center of the material. But for something like this, where it's a lot of kind of, I don't know if I should say arbitrary noise, but it's doesn't matter specifically about where it is placed on the edge.
No, because it's actually quite organic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a texture that the edges and so on of the material itself will be defined more by the object than the actual noise of it.
For
There
sure.
we go. So you were explaining all of this is racial information. Did you transfer this directly into a color map, or did you change something else, or you didn't use
No, so
color
this
map at
was
all?
I didn't use color maps at all for this.
Okay.
This was directly into an output as a grayscale image. I
What-
could have added color to it, but a lot
Yeah.
of times I just need the base information to work off of, and then whatever I'm using this marble for specifically, I can get into the colors and really get into the specifics of whatever the use is for that material that I'm using it in.
Now, when it comes to, I see that as the outputs, you have one with the full map, but then you have another one that is in bursts. Why do you have them split in that case?
I did this mostly to make creating masks easier. If I needed to kind of separate out certain sections of the marble, just running it through an invert and a histogram scan just allows me just a little bit more information to work with whenever I do bring up this custom node.
So going back to the material when we were talking initially, the overall croissant material, let's get a little bit more into how you set up everything in here to actually layer the materials in their different parts and, well, get into the end of, the rendering of it. How do you combine this? Because as far as you see, this right here looks like a really small graph, but it has a lot of things going on. And I see a lot of Atlas nodes as well. How do you use them to your advantage in this case?
Yeah, so in order to combine the croissants with the cooling rack material that I had made, I knew that I needed variety in the croissants. So I have the graph, the croissant-specific graph, pulled into here to use and be able to pull out all of the color and normal information and whatnot from it. But as we talked about earlier, I needed to get that kind of variation through warping and using random seed changes and stuff for each individual croissant, to make sure there was that variation between them all. So I found the best solution to kind of blend all of that information was an Atlas scatter node, because that allowed me to use base color, normal, roughness information that I already had. In a lot of materials, I would choose to scatter this information earlier on when I'm still working with just grayscale, because that tends to be easier. But for this project, I was really focused on creating one really good croissant and then creating variation and changing it more later on in the process. So using the Atlas scatter node was the right way to do that, which then meant that I needed to take these croissants that I had made and turn them into an Atlas. So actually, again, I'm using a custom node that I've made before here that I've titled Easy Atlas, which quite simply just takes all of the inputs and runs them through a variety of transformation nodes, and just allows me to select different ones and scale them and position them together as needed, so that I can have 4 different croissants in the different corners.
So what did you use? What did you make your own node in particular, instead of using the ones of maybe Substance Designer provide in this case for the Atlas? Because making an Atlas is way different to making a marble material. Like the level of complexity is way too different.
Yeah, I created the Easy Atlas originally when I was working on a more foliage-based progress, and I needed a variety of grass cards laid out for a texture. There are options to do similar things to this in Substance, but I wanted something that was just as extremely simple and straightforward as possible, where I could just click on the Edit in 2D button and just move around and have that really easy movement, placement, and scaling without having to worry about any kind of excess stuff or complications that a different node might use. Essentially, it just gives me entire control, and because I've built the node, I know exactly how it works, and I know that it won't break, or I don't have to worry about something not working quite right. So it's just kind of an ease of use thing of understanding just it would be something that I needed to use repeatedly, and it's really simple to do.
Okay, perfect. And from here, you get this into an Atlas and you start creating, the overall layout of your material. Yes, I loved it. Yes, they look great.
Yeah,
So
so
really good.
the
Yes.
Atlas Scatter was super great and easy to use.
Hmm.
And it's just about adjusting a lot of the values slightly to get that kind of variation in the rotation, a slight variation in scale, and a
Wow.
variety of other things. The roughness is ever so slightly changed on all of them. I won't go through all of the kind of specific numbers, but it's just, and the color as well, just providing those little slight changes that individually you wouldn't notice, but once you add all of them up together,
Hmm.
you get that kind of nice variation that makes it look more realistic and varied.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I do agree with you a lot. I love this material, to be honest. And now being at this point, I have a really good question, a new one. What came
Okay.
first, the idea for the render or the material? Because right now, that image we have there in the 2D viewport looks exactly like your render. So did you get the idea of making a render like the ones you have in ArtStation by looking like this? Or did you have any other reference that inspired you into doing that, so you made the material this way to get the render you have?
Ooh, it's a chicken versus the egg kind of question.
Yeah, basically, mind-blowing.
I'm not really sure where it starts, to be honest. It's a lot of back and forth of, like I said earlier, I had an idea for what I kind of wanted the end render to look like, but that does change a fair amount as I'm working on a material. My kind of perception of what I want it to be changes a little bit. So a lot of it is getting kind of something into Marmoset that won't be the finished version. I went through a lot of work in progress shots where they're not nearly as good as the final render.
That's something
but then
I always say. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but that's something I always say. Between the start of the project and the final render you usually see from professionals, where the render looks 10 out of 10, it looks amazing. Like there's like at least 100 shots that went out horrible, like horrible. Yes, that's the difference between someone who gets to do it right and maybe people that don't get to do it, is because the people who got it right was because they did 100 shots wrong till they get one that was completely right. That's the difference.
It's never going to be perfect the first time you render it out.
No,
it just never will.
It never will.
So yeah, a large part of it was bringing it into Marmoset and starting to set up some of the lighting and camera angles and stuff that I wanted. And then realizing, well, something's completely wrong about this. This doesn't look exactly how I wanted it to at all. And then going back into Designer and changing things. And it's really just a back and forth process of that kind of look development of, now that I have it in that kind of final software and I'm starting to get the lighting that I want for it, what needs to change, and just doing a lot of back and forth and tweaking after that. So I'm not sure which came first, really. I'll say it's a cycle, and all at the same time.
Yeah, it's kind of like work. Like for me, it's the same. I have like let's say a preview scene of Marmoset where I see how my materials look, but that's just to preview my material and see how it's doing. Then I usually, depending if there's a super passion project I have, I do change the things on how it looks in the render.
I do something really similar. I have a scene, a Marmoset scene saved out that has a lot of basic camera and lighting setup stuff already, so that I can throw something in and immediately get a feel for how it'll look, and then I can create a copy of that file to do more specific work for the project.
So could we see, for example, right now how it looks in Marmoset? Or is your computer going to blow up? Because that happens to me a lot. So I do get it if
I stop sharing this and kind of close everything down, then I should be able to, but we'll see.
Great. Let's see. Let's give it a try. So we are back into Marmoset. Where are you from, James?
I am from North Carolina in the United States.
Why are you drinking mate? The thing.
Oh, it's just water. I just have a big thing of
I
water.
thought it was the thing that they drink in my country for a moment. I visually, as it's so small on my screen, it's just I didn't see it right. So this is your Marmoset file, and it actually looks really good. And I'm amazed that it's not blowing up and that you are able to move. You're in the.
I am too. I'm not going to put ray tracing on because I do think that will
okay. That's the difference. I'm gonna move our cameras away from there. Yes, because I had it just on top of that. So on the top left side, there's 3 icons. What are those 3 icons that you just selected?
So they're how how Marmoset kind of identifies the lighting situation. So the first one is raster rendering, which is high performance, but doesn't have a lot of the nice shadows and visual quality that a ray tracing render would have. The second one is hybrid rendering, which I believe is new to Marmoset Toolbag 5. I'm not a fan of it personally. I think it's just kind of a weird in-between that I haven't found a good use for yet. Maybe there is one, I just don't know.
Okay.
And then the third one is ray traced rendering, which is expensive but looks beautiful for final renders.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I can say
sharing
that.
my screen, I'll give it a try just to see if it'll work, but I think there's a high chance that this will crash it.
Let's see.
Oh, it did go through.
No, I mean, in my case, it goes through, but this is the big question. If you click on your plane, how many millions of polygons do you have?
Ooh, quite a lot. 10.9 million on this one, which isn't terrible, but for my poor computer, it's not great.
Yeah, no, because we have the same problem in Marmoset 4. I have like millions of polygons, and here, guys, my students always tell me you don't need that much poly. I differ. Yes, I think we do need that much poly if we're doing such materials that have a lot of displacement, and we want them to look like these. The more
especially for the cooling rack portion of it.
Yeah.
Because the cooling rack lines are so small, it needed more geometry to not be really jagged. Because it's such small detail that has so much height.
And I'm quite amazed with the actual quality of this, because despite the compression of Discord plus the recording, these looks really great. Yes, of course, the render itself looks amazing, and if you guys want to check it out, you can go to his portfolio to take a deep look into his latest shots on this material. So, yes, this looks amazing. Yeah. So, which are the different positions of the cameras you have, and why did you pick those positions?
Yeah, so I have 5 different kind of main cameras for the plane renders. The most important thing, I think, for a lot of these are that because of the nature of tessellation, a lot of these camera angles need to be very steep to hide some of that. So a lot of my kind of more top-down shots both give kind of a good feel and span for the croissants on the cooling rack, but also it just hides that kind of tessellation that you would get if you're looking very heavily at the side of them. It hides a lot of those kind of jagged edges that you get with tessellation. So that's kind of the main reason for a lot of those shots. Though I do have some at a little bit of an angle just to help
that one. I love it.
Yeah, this one's really fun. I like this one a lot. So yeah, a lot of it's just getting different cameras. A lot of it comes down to the lighting too, of just kind of, once I have my lighting set up, changing and moving the cameras around to kind of see what kind of angles look best. Do I want the lighting coming in from the top left, or do I want it coming in from the right? Like, where should the light be hitting the croissants in order to get a good variety of shadows in there to get that good contrast, along with how the roughness looks when the light hits it for the different croissants.
Yeah, well, that's something I was going to ask you, if you could go in this camera position, if we could go back to a little bit of the ray tracing, because right now we're not seeing the shadows, but look to change when he puts ray tracing and nothing blows up, thanks God.
Surprisingly.
Yeah. So you can see the shadows, they add so much value. Like, the reflections are pretty much the same, maybe they're higher quality, but the shadows are making this great. That's why when maybe you see some of my renders, guys, you kind of see that I do really strong shadows and contrast, because that's kind of like what gives that feeling of 3D shape. It ends up being, and of depth, of course, it's going to be the shadows itself. Yeah. So if you can go, you can turn the computer off, basically, go back to the non-ray tracing version so it doesn't blow up.
I can hear the fan start spinning.
Yeah, they start spinning, but this actually looks really, really amazing. I see you have a fog as well in there in your beauty setup. What are you using the fog for in this case? Because I tried in Marmoset 4 and it kind of like added way too much lighting for what I was trying to do. How did you use it in your case?
So the fog is just here to add just that little bit of extra depth feeling to a scene. Slowing down a little bit. So in this case, because the croissants are so close up on the cooling rack, it's a very subtle value of, it's not doing a whole lot. I have the opacity, max opacity value at 0.0,
Oh,
um,
yeah, that's really
to
low.
1. So it's doing very, very little, but I don't think I can. Maybe I can do a little bit. If I go back to, say, this camera shot and turn ray tracing back on, I don't know if that'll really come through on Discord.
No,
It
because
barely comes through in
no,
general.
it barely comes through because it needs to load every pixel of the screen as well on Marmoset.
But essentially, it just gives that ever so slight amount of fog at the far end of a shot, just to provide that really subtle bit of extra depth there for the viewer to see. Again, one of those things that on its own doesn't seem like it would do that much, but it's just one of the little details that adds to the overall shot in the end.
Yeah, that's actually quite great. So, James, thanks for coming today. I really don't have much more questions. I should have prepared a little bit more, maybe for next time. I'm gonna get a little bit ready because I saw other materials in your portfolio that they are really, really great, and I also would like to see a breakdown of them, and I'm sure people as well would like to.